as we jump into this episode, here's what I want to do because, as many of you know, I am a youth pastor. I just can't shake it. I've been in student ministry for the last almost 30 I was going to say 30 decades, 30 years, 3 decades. I know my math. And so I've been in student ministry for that long as both a practitioner, a consultant, or a mentor, or in some capacity in urban context and suburban context. And, now here with our team at Student Leadership University. And so our Memorial Day, end of the summer series session is going to be entitled The Practice. And what I'm going to do is going to be a 2-parter. And so the first part is really, talking about how to cultivate programming, right? And so the overarching theme of our talk for the next 2 weeks will be the practice, the nuts and bolts of effective student ministry. How, from a very practical standpoint, how do we approach student ministry? What I love about my partnership with my brother Brent and how we approach conversations is, I look at it through the practitioner standpoint. I love how he can look at it through a historical context or a theological standpoint. Man, we bring great synergy and balance to our conversations. But for this conversation for the next 2 weeks, we're really going to get into the weeds a little bit of practice. I know many of you have attended our youth pastor summits, events, and, in our labs, we try to, not just talk about things from a high level, macro view, but just also want to get down into the weeds a little bit on some things. And so that's what I want to do. I love, to do that for the next 2 weeks. So here's the thing. If you are listening to this podcast right now and you are driving, don't worry. We're going to have all of what I'm talking about in our show notes. So, because it's going to be a lot of practical nuggets and tips and processes and ideas and stuff. And so we'll have show notes where really you'll be able to pull everything that I'm talking about down from the show notes. So if you're driving or you're on a flight and you're listening to this, or, you're somewhere where you're not able to pull out a notebook and write, don't worry about it. It's all good. We'll have it in the show notes. But again, I want to talk about it from a 2-parter standpoint. So this week for this episode, I want to talk about it from the idea, the practice of cultivating effective programming. And then next week, what we're going to talk about is you, the leader. How do you cultivate, some practical approaches to leading yourself well? All right. So let's just jump right in. All right. And so we've had the horrible intro to the summertime song. Sorry about that. For those of you, I know that, singing is not my gifting. I recognize that. I think, great leaders are honest with themselves. And I know that my attempt to sing anything is always going to be an epic fail. And, we should make joyful noises unto the Lord. And so that probably wasn't joyful, but I'm sorry about that. So, but I do love this. This is going to get me fired up and excited. So, hope you enjoy it. So let's just kind of jump into this as looking at what are some very practical nuggets. If you are, as you're entering into this summertime, as a youth pastor, for me personally, what I would always look at this season, May, we celebrated mothers at the beginning of the month. Then we celebrated the graduates in the middle of the month. Simultaneously, as we were celebrating graduates, we're preparing for our summer activities, whether summer camp, mission trips, our summer internships. We're preparing for the summer. But somewhere along the journey, we had to prepare for the fall. That's kind of the rhythm of student ministry. And so, you're preparing, you're closing out what happened this past year in May, preparing for the summer. But in that, there is this point of where we come out of the summer, and August and September is kind of that relaunch into this next season of ministry. And so what I'm going to do is give you an all-encompassing group of nuggets, golden nuggets, as you're trying to cultivate some great, effective ministry programming for your student ministry. Now, many of these things aren't going to be any thing new under the sun. And maybe for some of you, you're doing most of these things. My prayer and hope is that if you're not doing all of them, or you may not have thought about some of them, that as you hear this conversation and this talk, that you'll say, oh, I didn't think about that. I need to do that. Or, oh, I did think about it this way, but I didn't think about it that way. All right. So what I would love to do is I want to start like big picture, broad scope, and let's funnel it down to get to where we want to be. All right. So I think, let me look, I got five things where we're going to talk about, we talk about the practice, the part one of cultivating effective programming, 5 things that I really want to talk about. First thing, let's just talk about the foundations. What's the foundations of an effective student ministry? An effective student ministry, foundationally, I think there's really 2 philosophies that we got to think about. First and foremost is what we'll call the biblical foundation. Now, of course, we're talking about ministry, so it's like, duh, Captain Obvious. Come on, I understand that. But what is the biblical philosophy of your student ministry? Now, for many of you, I know that you'll say, okay, Jeff, we have a theme text or a ministry text. This text is really the name, where our name comes from. But when I'm talking about, the biblical foundation of effective student ministry is really built around, in my humble opinion, around 2 very familiar passages of scripture, which is the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. You know that the CSB version, I love the CSB version of the Great Commandment when Jesus says this in Matthew 22, 37 through 40. Jesus says this. He says, love the Lord your God. That's number 1, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments. So foundationally, are you creating a ministry where you're teaching students to first and foremost, love the Lord their God with all their heart. All right, with all their heart, their soul, their strength. And then secondly, are you teaching your students to love their neighbor as their self? And if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and spirit, then it should be easy for you to love your neighbor. This speaks to loving the castaways, the throwaways, the giveaways, the least of these. This speaks to your willingness or ability to teach students to be receptive to diverse students coming into the ministry. So foundationally, we know biblical foundation, we build it off of this idea or reminder of the Great Commandment. But then also, secondly, that biblical foundation is the Great Commission. It's the Great Commission. And I love, again, the CSB version of Matthew 28, 18 through 20 that just simply says, Jesus says this. He says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And I like to add, and everything in between. He says, therefore, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of age. Now, again, these are 2 very familiar passages. I know who our audience and our listeners are, so I got it. I know that you know this, but it's just a gentle reminder that when we start from a high level principle, we want to make sure that there's these core foundational principles that we never move away from. We never should move away from teaching our students and our leaders to love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, and spirit. We should never move away from teaching our students and our leaders to love their neighbors as themselves. We should never move away from our leaders and our students understanding the significance of the mission at hand, and that's to go and make disciples. So the first foundation of an effective student ministry is the biblical philosophy, but then that's the second sub point under that particular ideal of foundation is the ministry philosophy. What is your ministry philosophy? This speaks to the mission and vision statements, as well as the core values of your student ministry. Is that one, clearly articulated and defined? Does it make sense to people? I mean, listen, if your mission and vision is a dissertation, that's a problem. It needs to be simple, and concise, and you should be able to rattle it out of your tongue and know it, like the back of your hand. And so you're asking questions. Who are we? What do we believe? Why do we exist? And you just want to make it easy to repeat. So when we think about the first thing, which is, so follow me on this, my tracking of thinking. Number one is foundations of effective student ministry. And the two bullet points are the biblical philosophy, number one, which is Great Commission, Great Commandment. And then number two is the ministry philosophy, which really speaks to the mission, vision, statement, and the core values. All right, so let's jump into number two. Number two, after the foundations of an effective student ministry, number two is the pillars. What are the pillars of an effective student ministry? And so, I love what Paul says. We all know Ephesians 4:2 is really asking this critical question that, are we equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry? And so when we think about the pillars of the student ministry, the pillars really is around your ministry team and understanding your adult volunteers and your student team, or your student volunteers, student leaders. And so when I think about pillars, I'm thinking about two pillars as far as leadership: adult ministry, student ministry. And here's what I would suggest. I think that there has to be a healthy balance. I think if you have all adult leaders and very few student leaders, really there's going to be an imbalance, I believe, of really effective ministry, because you want a ministry that's for the people, by the people, right? And then if you have too many student leaders and not enough adult leaders, then your leadership will lack a system of apprenticeship, mentorship, and really helping students lean into wise counsel. So when we think about that first level of the pillars, it is understanding the pillar of your ministry team. Are you effectively engaging both adult leaders and student leaders? The second pillar is parent engagement and involvement. Hey, leaders, can I just tell you, if you're trying to do ministry without the involvement of parents, you're going to really, really have a hard time. And the truth of the matter is, hey, we know that there's a lot of different conversations about what does that look like? How do we do that? What if the parents aren't involved? I get it, but at least there needs to be an intentionality of engaging parents, guys. If you don't have parents, on your team rocking with you, can I just tell you, man, it's going to be hard to really kind of have a ministry where you have true help and support, right? It's one thing to have support from your senior pastor and senior leaders, but man, parent support is so important. And so twofold, when I think about parent support and involvement, here's the question, two questions. First question is, how are you informing your parents? Like what's some intentional systems where you are trying to be very intentional to informing your parents? But then here's the second question. How are you resourcing them? You know what? This is a two-way relationship. For me as a student pastor, man, I wanted to make sure that I was offering some resources for my parents. I just didn't want it to be transactional. It was like, hey, I need your money for camp. I need your money for mission trip. I need you to help make breakfast if we're doing a lock-in. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just that. It was like, hey, how can I come alongside you and resource you as well? So you want to make sure that you're engaging parents. I wrote down something I love with Dr. Alan Jackson. He was a former professor at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He said something, and he's a pastor now at a great church, and he said something now. He says, when it comes to parents, you want to, number one, communicate everything. He says, number two, you want to create calendars with the family in mind. So create your calendar with the family in mind. Number three, he says, counsel by mostly listening. Make sure you're a good listener. Don't always try to come and infuse your opinion in that, but be a good listener. This is number four. As I mentioned before, he says connect families with resources. And we can talk about that in another episode because that is multi-layered. in that aspect. But then he also says, call parents to become discipleship makers, or excuse me, disciple makers. So he says, call parents to become disciple makers. Why? Because Deuteronomy 6 is a real thing, right? And we believe in Deuteronomy 6. So I love those things that Dr. Jackson, Alan Jackson shared. But so you got to make sure that one of those pillars is about the parent. So first pillar is your ministry teams, adults and student leaders. Second pillar is the parents. Make sure you are involving them and informing them, but also resourcing them. But then the third pillar is your programming, right? Your programming. And so, how are you shaping your programs, your events, your gatherings, your activities around the vision and mission and core values, what we talked about earlier? I would suggest on that part that if there is something that does not fit with your mission, vision, or your core values, it's probably a good idea not to do it. People are going to come with a lot of ideas, but you got to stay in your lane. And in the words of Bill Belichick, Coach Bill Belichick, do your job. Do your job as a ministry. What is God calling you to do? Who is God calling you to be as a ministry? For us at Student Leadership University, we know that our core mission is to help students tell a different story with their life. We want to help students to learn how to think, how to dream, how to lead. And everything that we do is centered around that truth. And so you got to make sure that what you're doing program-wise, events-wise, gathering-wise, activity-wise, like it's within the synergy or the orbit of your mission, vision, and values. Because there's really a tension when we think about programming. There's a tension between attractiveness and authenticity. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes and I say we because I've been guilty of this as a leader, sometimes we want to be so attractional and relevant and edgy that we compromise the integrity of Scripture and we compromise the integrity of the programming. And so you want to make sure that there is a healthy balance. Now, you don't want to be stale and outdated in your gatherings and your program. You want to make sure that your programmings are up to par. It connects with culture. It's culturally relevant. But man, you got to have great balance. But even with that, I might go a little bit further to say, again, in my humble opinion, that authenticity should be a higher priority and value than attractional, excuse me. Because I think if we're more authentic, I think that gives us more substance, depth, and we give our students something that they can hold on to for the rest of their life. So don't compromise being authentic and theologically and biblically sound in your doctrine, your teaching, and your philosophy and program. Don't sacrifice that at the altar of attraction and being attractional. And so you want to make sure that you're have a healthy mix of being both attractional and authentic. But then there's also your strategic planning. In strategic planning, your programming is what are some of your short-term goals, your long-term goals, your future outlook. Take advantage of your calendars. How are you building your calendars, not just around the needs of the family, but also around holidays. In Atlanta, man, football was a lowercase g god. So the falls for us was interesting and it was tough, especially during midweek, because a lot of our guys were in practice or in marching band, or a lot of our ladies as well were in marching band or cheerleading, all that stuff. So you want to make sure that you're intentional around your calendaring and your strategic planning of your programming. But then also we got to talk about, the money, the budget. That's a pillar too. That's a part of the pillar, making sure that your budget reflects your strategic plan not a wish list, right? And so you want to make sure that you're having budget conversations with key members of your leadership team, probably about 4 to 6 weeks, maybe even, I would suggest if you can, 12 months out would be awesome. But you at least want to go 6 weeks. 6 months, not weeks, but 6 months out. You want to make sure that you're doing that. Be wise and very committed to being a good steward of your finances. Hey, let's, as youth pastors and youth leaders, debunk this myth that we are loose with the money, or debunk this myth that we can't be responsible with our with the Lord's. Let me say not ours, but with the Lord's resources. So that's important. All right, let me move along. So I got a couple more. Number 3 is the process of discipleship within an effective ministry. How are you really building a scope and sequence within your student ministry of discipleship? I think evangelism is important. Yes. But I think equally discipleship is important. And how are you living out Matthew 28? How are you being, how are you making disciples within your student ministry? I love what Peter Drucker once said. He says, you cannot manage what you can't measure. So how are you measuring success in discipleship? And so you want to make sure that you have some systems in place that are helping you manage your system of discipleship. And so, for time's sake, I'm not going to stay there long, but I just want to say, hey, the process of discipleship, that is very, very important in being successful as a student ministry and a student ministry leadership. And so student ministry, I wrote down in my notes that student ministry can't be a holding pattern. There has to be movement, meaning, we get them in, but we don't want to just sit them right there in our gatherings and stuff, man. We want to send them out, man. There needs to be this cycle. There needs to be movement. We get them in, we inspire them, we encourage them, we, get them going, man. And we share with them the importance of being saved so that they can be sent. And then we do just that. We send them out. It's one thing to gather. It's another thing to go. And so I believe God's calling you to make sure you're sending people out. All right, number four, partnerships. I think that's an important aspect of developing or the practice of an effective student ministry. It is partnerships, because they're necessary for an effective student ministry. So what are your partnerships like? So there's 2 types of partnerships. First is internal, second is external. What are some internal partnerships? Well, internal partnerships are obviously partnerships. How are you partnering with your lead pastor, or senior pastor, other ministry leaders, parents again, executive staff teams? Like, how are you really partnering with these key leaders within your church? And so there is the what I call the internal partnerships. But then there's external partnerships. How are you partnering with other ministries around in your area, other nonprofits or parachurch organizations like Student Leadership University? Shameless plug. But how are you externally partnering with other organizations or parachurch ministries? And so, but when I say about the external partnership, let me just say this. You'll hear me use the term transactional a lot, because I think it's important when we talk about partnerships that we see partnerships as a 2-way street. So when you're going through the mindset and the idea of partnerships, let me ask you a question. With your partnerships, or you should ask the question. Let me say it this way. You should ask the question. You should be asked the question, how can we as a ministry and an organization partner with other organizations to, 1, serve them? How can we serve these external organizations? And then 2, of course, how can we benefit from our partnerships with these external organizations? So partnership is number 4. And then number 5, the final one, is your personal growth. And I really want to kind of just land a plane right here, because this is where I'm going to pick up next week. Because in our next episode, we're really going to talk about and really get in the weeds of you, the leader, and your personal growth. Because I really believe we can't take people places we've not been ourselves. And so if we want to see our students and the people around us grow and be healthy in ministry, I think it's important that, man, we ourselves are healthy. And so, here's a couple questions that I'll just kind of leave with you as a little nugget to lead us into next week. Number one, in your personal life, is there devotion that you have with God? Like, are you have that personal devotional time? Number two, are you attending conferences, seminars, and workshops to help you become a better version of yourself? 3, are you being mentored by somebody else? 4, are you fellowshipping with other youth ministries? You don't want to be a silo. A lot of times we can get so caught up in what we're doing internally that we're not externally, out there connecting with and networking with other people and collaborating with other people. And then number 4, are you reading great books, or are you subscribing, to great resources? So I kind of want to give you just a little nugget right there, because I promise you we're going to deep dive in that. We're going to jump in the deep end of the pool on that next week. So, hey guys, as always, man, thank you so much for just your support, your love. I always love, and I know my brother Brent does as well, I love when you guys kind of, tag us on social media about, hey man, this podcast was great, or give us shout outs, or we see you at churches or events or whatever. You're like, man, I enjoyed that podcast episode. So on behalf of my brother, hey, thank you so much. But as always, if you know somebody who needs a great podcast, we would love for you to, share our podcast with other people. We need you to like it. Make sure as you're sharing, you're also encouraging people to subscribe. And if you have not subscribed yourself, question is, why not? Come on, people. So subscribe, review. Only positive reviews, that's kind of all we want here, No, but seriously, we love for you to review. And then always, we love for you to follow us and stay connected with us. 3 ways you can follow us. Follow us, number 1, at SLU Lead. That's at SLU Lead. You can follow me personally at I am Jeff Wallace, at I am Jeff Wallace. And you can follow my brother, my homie, my dog, go dogs. And so my brother, Brent Crow, at Brent A. Crow. That's at Brent A. Crow. Until next time, my friends, make sure you're being very intentional about every moment of your day of being the best version of yourself. We'll see you next week. God bless you. Peace.